Hi, in this video, I will analyze the poem To His Beloved Self by Vladimir Mayakovsky, a Russian poet and also one of the most leading figure of the early 20th century. Mayakovsky is often remembered not only for his, let's say, innovative poetic style, but also for his emotional intensity that you'll find in this poem, and that also defines much of his work. His poetry stands as the intersection of personal turmoil. Most of his poetry, he often writes about various emotional turmoils. He talks about loneliness, unrequited love, and so on. Well, in this discussion, I will briefly introduce you about the poet himself and the movement associated with him, and then I will move towards an interpretation of the poem, and by particularly paying attention to its themes and emotional texture. And if I have enough time, I will try to go line by line with the poem itself. Mayakovsky, if you follow his past life, emerged when there was a huge political and cultural transformation in Russia. He is also one of the leading figures of the movement called Russian Futurism. The Russian Futurism is a movement that sought to break away from tradition. Poets and artists try to eliminate the traditional way of writing poetry, or the traditional way of, let's say, interpreting poetry. And they try to relate it, try to implement the use of new languages that's appropriate to the modern age. Well, at the same time, the futurists, they experimented with fragmented lines, unconventional imagery, and so on and so forth. Mayakovsky, if you see, his personal life was equally intense. He possessed a passionate revolutionary spirit, and was a strong supporter of the Russian Revolution. But you must note that at the same time, his life was also marked by emotional turbulence, as you can see in this poem. So the emotional turbulence can be particularly seen in his complicated relationship with Lilia Berg, who profoundly influenced this poetry of his. Now coming to the title of the poem, To His Beloved Self. Well, as you can see, the title of the poem itself immediately captures our attention, right? To his beloved self, rather than addressing another person, the poet turns, let's say, he turns inwards, and addresses his own self rather than addressing someone else, he tries to express the subject here, the subject of affection here. He tries to portray his own self, as, let's say, as if it was the object of attention. Then this gesture, if you ponder, perhaps you will realize that this specific gesture of the poet here introduces to the central tensions of the poem, where the speaker becomes simultaneously the lover of the beloved and at the same time the observer and the subject. You see, through this unusual, let's say, self-address, Mayakovsky here dramatizes a profound sense of inner division. If you pay attention, if you pay close attention to the opening lines, of the poem, you will see that the speaker is addressing to himself with an intimate tone. You can say that the voice is rather affectionate and ironic at the same time. By speaking to himself in this way, you can say that the poet reveals a striking loneliness, his emotional turmoil, and the dialogue that would normally occur between two people is instead transformed into a dialogue within the self. You see, this is the self-conversation, you can say, that suggests the poet feels separated, from the surrounding, from the society and from the world itself, where he feels a sense of loneliness, and you will find it in the opening lines of the poem. The poet expresses the emotional intensity as well in the poem, and the speaker describes that immense power of his emotion in the poem. Mayakovsky frequently employs exaggerated images to express the magnitude of his inner life and his feelings. If you pay close attention to his lifestyle, his feelings appear almost overwhelming, you can say, as though they possess a force capable of reshaping the world around him, and all of these you can see it repeating and getting painted in his poetry. This dramatic intensity is the characteristic of the futurist poetry here, which often sought to capture the energy, and also you can see the turbulence of modern existence. Apart from observing the poem as an emotional confession, or as an emotional embracement, or an admiration, self-admiration, this poem at the same time is not, you can say it is a contrast of it. It's not just about the expression of self-admiration or sort of a narcissist poem, because as we continue reading the poem in the later lines, you will see that there's a subtle tension in the speaker's voice. If you pay close attention to it, you will notice the subtle tension, in the speaker's tone, where he praises his emotional depth, but at the same time, he appears to be very well aware of the theatrical nature of his own feelings. He is pretty much alive, pretty much sober to realize what is going on around him and what his feelings are. There is you can say a kind of a double consciousness at work, which can be pretty complex and enigmatic, but at the same time the poet simultaneously glorifies and questions himself. This is the intense contradiction that gives the poem its psychological depth. Going ahead into the poem, there's another important dimension that you will observe, And that is the sense of alienation. In the poem, the speaker, the poet himself, Mayakovsky, suggests that the world around him does not or is not capable of understanding his emotional depth, his emotional experience, and this feeling of being misunderstood, it adds up to the poet's sense of isolation. In this way only, the poem reflects a broader, modern condition, the experiences of individuals who feel estranged, you can say that, from society and are compelled to turn inward in search for meaning and value of life. So that is the emotional and the sense of alienation that is going on in the poet's thought and his expressions in this poem. At the same time, Mayakovsky used this poem as a weapon, as a sort of a message to convey, or in other words, to dramatize himself, to present himself, almost as you can say, as a tragic protagonist, a victim, of the modern world. You can say that, a victim of society, where he faces emotional turbulences and various other obstacles. His emotional suffering becomes a sort of a grand and that theatrical transformation that transformed his personal pain into powerful artistic expression. You see, this is the dramatic style that can be observed, as the central objective to Mayakovsky's poetic identity. And he obviously, most of the time he used and he tries to portray himself as as both of that revolutionary figure and a deeply vulnerable individual. This is what his poem portrays. In the last, you can say, last few closing lines, the poem returns in the quiet tension with which it began. Okay, although the speaker addresses himself with affection, at the same time the underlying tone remains melancholic. After all, this poem is all about self-expression, and all about the melancholy of life. The poem ultimately suggests that you can say self-love, self-affection cannot entirely resolve the deeper human need for connection. That's what the poet tries to convey to the audience. What remains is the image of an individual standing alone with his own emotions, attempting to understand himself, attempting to search for his purpose, search for his value, of life, but going through it through the language of poetry. This is all about finding yourself through the language of poetry. This is what the poet aims to express and convey to his audiences. In this poem, to his beloved self, Mayakovsky turns the act of you can say self-reflection, into poetry. The speaker becomes, you can say, both the lover and the beloved, both the observer and the observed, through this strange and powerful dialogue, conversation with himself in the poem. He reveals this, you can say, fragile, divided, emotional emotional nature of the modern self. You see, perhaps this is why Mayakovsky's poetry still resonates today.